Good afternoon, everyone. We're about to begin. So, we're going to introduce Micha van Waesberghe. He is the head of KM at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and his presentation is Frontline of KM, How to Establish Successful KM Programs.
Not necessary. Well, thank you. I appreciate you all being here. As was mentioned, I'm currently the head of knowledge management at Millennium Challenge Corporation. It's a U.S. federal agency working in development assistance. If you know about USAID, it's a sister institution, if you will. Just a little bit, I guess, about me. I started my career working in international relations and democratization and human rights. Then I got transitioned. If you were here yesterday, Bill Kaplan spoke. Anybody here know Bill Kaplan or saw him speak? So he's the one that convinced me to try knowledge management, to which my first response was, what? But he did convince me eventually, and I haven't looked back since. After working with Bill, I worked at the Inter-American Development Bank, also here in D.C., and most relevantly, and what I want to talk to you about today, one of the efforts that I was asked to lead while I was there was to set up a knowledge management program in one of our country offices, and particularly in El Salvador. And obviously, since joining MCC as the head of knowledge management, it was the first time they had that role. It was the first time that they really formalized their KM program. And so again, I had to face the challenge of setting up a KM program, if you will, from scratch. Although I'll talk a little bit more about Scratch. Is Scratch really Scratch? In just a second. So those are I have to walk back and forth. I apologize to move slides, otherwise it's going to be very boring visually. What I want to talk to you about today is not going to focus initially on the technical aspects of KM, communities of practice, technology, and so on and so forth, but really what does it take to establish the foundation of a KM program in an organization from a leadership perspective, if you were a CKO trying to set up a KM program. So hopefully you'll find it of interest. If you have any questions, thoughts, stories of your own, I plan to do it more as a storytelling. Please feel free to just jump in, ask any questions, and we'll weave our way through the session that way. But hopefully I'll be able to cover everything that you're interested in. So the reason I picked this as the first picture is because it can seem a little bit like a maze that you have to tackle, and there certainly are a number of challenges that you immediately confront when you're hired as a, let's say, first knowledge manager, head of knowledge management, CKO, in an organization. A couple of things probably have already been decided for you at that particular point in time, namely, where's this program of yours going to live in the organizational structure? That's probably been decided by the people that hired you. That decision already sets you either on a potential dead-end course or gives you the opportunity to be successful. For example, at the IDB, the Knowledge and Learning Program is tucked away as a department under sectors. Then, right as I was moving on to MCC, they moved it as its own department together with communications. Structure matters at MCC. I started out being in the OCEO's office, which is, I would say, generally speaking, among the most beneficial places to be for a KM program. Why? Because a KM program is there to serve the entire agency and not a parochial department. So once you start getting buried in a organizational structure, over time, the pressures of how the organization works and the relationships of the top-level management can come into play in terms of what you work on and how effective you can be. In general, I will say there's a lot of dead ends in setting up a KM program. And so you can do everything right and still not succeed, and it has in part to do with what I just said in some of those organizational pressures and situations that come into play. So let's talk about how you might navigate a maze like this and hopefully come out smelling like roses on the other side. So the first picture after that I want to show you is a couple of years ago I wrote a blog online, and it's called The First Mistake KM Programs Make. So I figured I should start there. And this is it. It's the assumption that even as a new CKO coming into a program where they're desperate, it's like, tell me what knowledge management is, you're here, you've got a budget, you're free to do, you're the expert, tell us what you need. The wrong assumption would be that what you're walking into is an organization that's like a blank canvas, that you can just paint and put everything and organize everything the way you want. That's not how it works. You're not there to just simply deploy your tools. You know what works, you're the expert, and so on and so forth. Instead, the room you're walking into is a little bit more like this. There's a lot going on in this room, but it's more realistic and more representative of what organizations are actually like when you walk into the door. So if you were the CKO of this room, what do you see? Sorry? I still didn't hear. A child, yeah? How's the child doing? Messy. Pretty exasperated, perhaps, or tired, I'm not sure. Certainly not, doesn't seem like a positive image. What else is there? You're a CKO, you're walking into an organization, you want to understand how are you going to add value, how are you going to make knowledge work for this organization. So what challenges, what opportunities does this room present to you? A lot of what? A lot of stuff, okay. A lot of stuff, okay. Ooh, there's a dresser. I don't know what's in it, but they have something to organize something with. That could be an asset. I don't know what I'm going to see and how I'm going to feel when I open the drawers, but I see something there. Oh, he's frustrated. He's upset. So I have users that are already pretty up to here with how knowledge works for them at this point. Okay?
There seems to be a lot of duplicated tools or duplicated toys.
Okay. Sure.
There's a bit of organization, piles of certain things that look like they.
Some things are organized. Okay. Anybody notice the little bookshelf here in the corner? That could be good. There seems to be some form of technology. I'm not sure how useful it is. It's still on the floor. They may not like how it's working for him. Somebody else suggested saw in his pictures, like, I would just like to get the kid out of the room. I'm like, yeah, that's not how families work, and that's not how organizations work either, right? These are the people I'm supposed to serve here in the end. So, yes, sir.
Contrary to that's just-in-time information. Information in the workflow.
Sure.
Everything is right where he needs it.
He might know exactly where everything is. So it's working for him, right? Now, is it working for his mom? No. That's also a knowledge management problem, right? Because I may be in control of my universe and know where everything is, and I can do my job today, but institutionally that may not solve everything. Okay. Honestly, another thing I see is I see a lot of creativity here. There's a lot of, a lot of things are being tried. So I think there's some assets there as well. Understanding that this is what you're walking into is critical. Because the next step, or the challenge that you have in walking into this room, is that this is you. They don't know you. And do they know knowledge management? And if they think they know knowledge management, would you agree with what they would think knowledge management is? Likely, no, no, and no. So that's a problem, because you're expected to deliver results. So how do you deal with this situation? Obviously, I would say the first thing you got to do is listen. I mean, one room I could walk into, and even then I still don't know what everything that's going on. But an entire organization of small, 50, medium, 500, large, 50,000 people. How do I know what's going on here? And how do I get them to know me? So these are all things that you have to be very conscious of. And, I don't say no to meetings ever. Anybody can come talk to me for any reason. And it may only be in a minute way related to knowledge management, but I will have gotten something out of it. So the idea of enabling, creating an initial understanding of what you understand knowledge management to be is critical. But you can't do that in a preachy, let me tell you how it's going to be type of way, because they're going to spit you out before they chew on you. So it's a very delicate balance. And it has to do with this. Any guesses what this is about? Yes, on the first try. Excellent. I don't know who said it, but yes, trust. Trust. How do you get them to trust you? Because likely you're going to need their time. Likely you're going to need to spend some resources. So how do you get them to trust you to do anything at all? They don't know you. They don't know KM. Or they may have been frustrated by years and years of failed efforts or other things that they called KM or who knows what. MCC, I've been at MCC for almost a year now. But and it's an agency that's, if you're not familiar, it's brand new, relatively speaking, in government terms. It was founded in 2005. So it's not even 15 years old, 2004, 2005. And they started recognizing knowledge management as a problem in 2011. I was brought on board in 2018. So that's, even forgetting about the early years where everything, is just new, they've been struggling with this for 7 years. 7 years is a long time for things not to be working while the agency is actively trying to do something about it. Which means people have been talking about knowledge management, they've done something and it didn't work, it didn't deliver results. So the level of skepticism that I walked into varied from, you seem like a nice kid, to, yeah, why would I give you the time of day? So how do I get them to trust? Well, I go back to listening. I went around and spent a lot of time figuring out what people's problems were, what they were struggling with. And not just, ask 2 questions, take some notes, think, shake their hand, and walk away. I went back and again and again. So I spent months listening. And it helped, and my strategy was to be light on knowledge management initially in my conversations. Why? Because I don't know what room I'm in yet. I don't know what it looks like exactly. So there's a lot I didn't know. There was more I didn't know than I did know. I knew knowledge management, but that's irrelevant at that point in time. What I didn't know is the organization. And until I'm ready to match the knowledge management to the organization, I'm not ready. So, of course, whenever I had a chance, I would tell them a little bit. I try to give them little crackers here and there, little tidbits of what I thought or what might help, or things I'd heard from other places that seem to be building a narrative of something that's a big priority in the organization. It helps to know what you're talking about, clearly. And it's okay to show that every now and then, but I would not recommend leading with that. So that's trust. The final, I would say, persistent challenge is this one. Any guesses? Bureaucracy? Sorry? Daunting? Yeah, I picked this one, for better or worse, for lack of authority. So you're the little guy trying to get the organization to move. As we all know, knowledge management is a change discipline. We're always trying to change something for the better. The way we work, new tools and technology, whatever it might be, new processes, new ways of learning. But what's our actual authority to implement those in most cases? The environments that I've worked in, even when I sat at the OCEO office, that I'm not the CEO itself, that doesn't give me the authority. My clients are in the operational side or in the administrative side, the corporate side. They have their own power structure. I'm not even in that power structure. So how do I get them to do anything? How do I get them to buy in to this amazing thing called knowledge management and what it can do for them? This is a very pervasive problem for knowledge management programs. Obviously, what helps is having leadership support. So if you have the CEO or the president or head of agency or whatever it might be, on your side, and this person is willing to communicate and reinforce messages, this is very important. I would say it's not enough. What I've had to do, for example, in El Salvador, that's exactly what I had. It was a fairly contained environment. I had both the, what in IDB terms is what we would call, or compared to an ambassador or the head of the office, and the chief operating officer. They were both supportive of me, whereas everybody else had no idea who I was and why I was there. But that helped a lot, because that gave me just a little bit of room to introduce myself to everybody, because they knew that the boss upstairs wouldn't want them to be rude to me, let's put it that way. And that gave me enough time to make my case. At MCC, when I came in, like I said, they've been working on it for 6 years, and the last thing that they did before I came on board, they hired me, was to establish what they call the KM core team. Worker level people, one from every major department or division. And they were made available to sort of help support, think through things. So I used them as a resource immediately to try to understand more and more about the agency, about the different departments and divisions. So I had the top and I had the worker level. What was missing was the management level. So we established what we call the KM steering committee, which is every top manager below the politicals, and if you're familiar with feds, right below the politicals, the managing directors, all of them are on the KM steering committee. It's the only body of its kind within MCC that is that level, that diverse, covering the entire agency. And it's about knowledge management. Who would have thought? But they have been critical. They are critical to this day. Because within their respective departments, they do have authority. I don't. But if I can get them around the table to talk about what matters to them and hear each other out and present to them a plan that makes sense to all of them, then I have my marching orders. Now I can go into their departments and say, Leader A knows about this. I'm here to talk to you about it. What does it mean to you? So there are ways to work around this, but it is definitely a constraint. So after all that listening and explaining and introducing yourself, a picture should start forming of how you fit in. And it's sort of the last piece before you're really ready to go. As I mentioned, you're always going to walk into a busy room and you don't know which room it is. I'll give you an example. Both the IDB and MCC work with what they would call executing agencies, meaning we do development projects which are executed by other countries, which means those countries have to set up project management units that, once the project is basically given to them, have to execute it, build the bridge in their country, build the road, build the hospital, and so on and so forth. That project management unit in those developing countries, they have recurring challenges in terms of their own capacity to run those projects. It's just one of those things. So about 7 years ago now, the IDB, in response to that, set up a special team within my department to start training and growing capacity in those local development projects. Why do I say that? Because that has been very successful at the IDB, and they've made a real impact with those efforts. So I knew that coming to MCC, and I knew that they were going to face the same types of issues. And of course, as soon as I started asking, all these capacity issues started coming up. And I started wondering, oh boy, where is their project management capacity building team? Who's doing this for MCC? Because if they're not doing it, it may come back to me. And I know that's a big effort. No problem, but there's a lot of things going on. So I was actually relieved that I think it was my second month, I sat down for a meeting with somebody, and he introduced himself as the leader of the Integrated Project Management Unit. And I started smiling. I said, really? Who with? And he said, well, with the executing agencies. And I said, I'm so glad you're here, because it means there's another partner already addressing an issue. How can I add value to that process if it's already going on? Lots of ways. How are they learning? How are they sharing knowledge from one country to another? These are all things that for them are questions they have not yet answered, but I don't have to invent it from the beginning. It was already there, in part. In fact, I connected that program with the program at the IDB so they could do knowledge sharing, because the IDB program is 7 years ahead. They've learned, and they actually did a public expose, the MCC team, and said that they had probably cut their learning curve short by 2 years because of that exchange with the IDB, because they just simply knew what was ahead for them. So this picture means you have to find, out of all the things you could be doing, knowledge management is hugely broad, from touching organizational development to technology implementation, operational learning, so on and so forth. Where can you add the most value with the resources that you have? Which changes is the organization most in need of, and which is it most likely to accept? What's the right balance between quick wins, things that you can show that you're making an impact today, or taking on that big challenge of, I can't find anything in my room? That's a big problem that I can help solve, but it's probably going to take 2 or 3 years to do it. Am I going to run out of room in terms of the space that people are willing to give me in the organization if all I do is that? Do I have to show something sooner? So all these things you have to try to balance, and the only way you can know that you're making a good judgment on that is if you've done all these other things that I've just described, if you really understand where the organization is. And assuming you just walked in 2, 3, 4 months ago, that's a tall order, but that's the ask. I showed this picture just to have everybody relax.
Where is that?
I have no idea, but I'd like to go there. No. But is everybody relaxed? Seeing this picture? Good. One purpose achieved. No, I showed this picture because it ties into what I just finished saying. Once you know what it is that you want to do, and you have an idea of where you want to start, you still have to ask the question, are we ready to implement this? Are we ready to achieve this vision from an organization-wide approach, or do I have to do pilots first? Am I ready to jump into the ocean and swim with the sharks and push this on an institution-wide basis, or am I going to go show how this works? Am I going to try to generate a demonstration effect with something to build more buy-in to it before I jump into the ocean? So, for example, for MCC, we developed through the KM Steering Committee that went all the way up to the highest level of the organization, where the roadmap and action plan, 3 years, got approved by the agency. Now you might say, "Oh, roadmap, action plan, that sounds really heavy. That's probably an 80-page Word document, got the little footnotes and everything in it." Yeah, I wrote that for the IDB 8 years ago. I don't know what anybody's doing with it there, but probably not much. No, it's pretty light. It's actually more like a PowerPoint presentation. I think it's like a 6-pager with background information. It's not necessarily that heavy. Why? Not what I expected that I would need to do, but that was okay for what the organization needed. Everybody felt comfortable with what it is that was being presented and what the plan was going to be. Now, in terms of jumping into the ocean of sharks, I guess, that MCC has to deal with is findability. It's really hard to find information at MCC. We have disparate systems, from shared drives, personal drives, OneDrive, Office 365, also SharePoint 2010, still running side by side, so on and so forth. A young agency, people sort of been used to having a lot of freedom of how they do things, and everybody's found their own comfort zone, but there's no organized way of doing it. So we, everywhere I went, and I'll tell you, of the spectrum of what KM is, I naturally have things that I'm more passionate about and other things that I can do, but they're sort of like, okay, if I have to, sure. Information management was not what I hoped would be such a big part of my focus, but when I came in, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. That was such a huge problem, and everybody was talking about it. Okay, so that also meant that I needed an institutional response, and I was going to be able to get buy-in on what was needed. So we are working institution-wide and actually formalizing a migration out of the old SharePoint into the Office 365 environment. We're getting the records, which is important in federal environments. Records teams are ramped up and getting them involved. We're getting designers involved. We're getting taxonomy and ontology projects underway, in part with the help of Enterprise Knowledge at some point, if somebody is here for that. Ben White, I don't know if you know him, but he helped us out with some of that. So there we're working institution-wide. The second priority that the MCC identified was operational learning. That's the one that makes my heart beat faster. That's the one I get really excited about. But when I came in, the first week, that KM core team I mentioned, they had already been drafting what they called a knowledge sharing policy for the agency, because none had ever been written before. And they were going to write down roles and responsibilities of everybody at the agency for knowledge sharing. And like I said, I was very aware of the fact that I didn't know very much about MCC at that time, but I felt confident enough to say, you should probably put that in the trash. And so I did. And the question I got was, but don't we need a policy to make it real? And I said, well, there's another way to get there. And it's not from our ivory tower telling the organization as we're KM and we shall tell you how to do knowledge sharing. Follow these rules. That's not it. The organization has to demand from us that they need something like this. It has to be their need that they voice to us first. Okay, how do we get there? I said, well, there are these things, learning before, during, after, peer assist, retrospect, after action review, everybody knows them, communities of practice, so on and so forth. There's all these practices that we can do. But let's find out first where the teams on the ground, what they need, where their pain points are. So we found some. Their pain points lie in, MCC is a very, I would say, culturally very great organization to work in, very open to learning in principle, but what they're lacking is structure, tools, ways of doing it. But individuals are interested up to a point. And organizationally, they're interested enough that they had put in requirements that every year, I believe, they are required to write down their lessons learned from their programs. So that requirement existed before I came in. How they do that, what's a good lessons learned, and what, when you write it down and so forth, and how are they shared, not as much development maturity had taken place there. So one of the pain points for operational teams was going through this what they thought it was a bureaucratic process, because they never saw any value coming out of it for them. It was a task given to them. So part of the job of knowledge management is to turn that around and make it into something value added. We have started with different country teams from Malawi, Zambia, and other countries to help facilitate retrospects around this for them. So they don't have to do a word-based, write your lessons learned here type document. We'll take care of that for you. Well, that got popular very quick. What do you mean? You're here to do my job for me for a second? I was like, yeah, I can do that. We can do that. So much so that it spread like wildfire, and people started calling me left and right about, could I do this, could I do that? And every time I'd meet with them, I'd start talking about what would be really valuable would be if we don't just talk to you at the end of the program, but we identify the challenges you're having right now and help you solve them based on knowledge that's already available. That sounds interesting. And so piece by piece, we're building it up. Coming back to that, the idea is that in maybe about a year or now, from now, we'll be in a situation where those managers at the top that may be hard to convince that sharing knowledge and lessons learned is worth their operational time, they'll be hopefully asking that this needs to be part of the way we work at MCC. This is not just something I did for Zambia or Malawi. This is something that every country needs to do because they're seeing value in it. If and when we've reached that point, I will have won that argument with that person who I told to put that knowledge sharing policy in the trash. Because that person asked, but how long will that take? And I said, well, that can take about 18 months. He said, 18 months, that's a long time. I said, yes, but what do you want to have in 18 months? a policy that people have endorsed and understand why and have actually asked for, or a piece of paper on a shelf that nobody cares about. That doesn't work. So in operational learning, I'm currently enjoying the pool. So all of that gets you a roadmap of the work that you want to do. At the IDB, I already mentioned, in 2011, I wrote the institutional strategy. So it wasn't my department strategy. It was an institutional strategy for knowledge and learning on behalf of the team, together with others, of course. Like I said, that document exists. That's about as much as I can say about it. In El Salvador, it was much more I used a different process where I basically handed it over to the team and allowed them to be the voice of what their priorities were. And then all I did was facilitate the process by which it would make it easier for them to achieve their goals. Their mantra was continuous improvement and innovation, so that became my mantra. That was, through knowledge management, I could serve those purposes. That was a one-year plan. As I mentioned, at NICC, it's a 3-year roadmap and action plan. But as we know, as you start implementing it, it doesn't tend to look like this. It looks a little bit more like this. But the most important thing is to keep going up. A word about measurement. Anybody involved in knowledge management knows that this can be a challenge, especially when you measure for attribution. But a few things I can mention that I think can be of value. I do think it's important to try to measure what you do. For example, at MCC now, with this findability problem that we have, we all know it's bad, but how bad is it? And how do we know it's when it's better? I mean, is everybody going to be happy and slapping me on the back that this is amazing? No, probably not. So how do we know, and how long will that take? How can I measure progress along the way? So what we designed in this case is, I call it the findability experiment. It's pretty simple. We basically picked 15 different pieces of content, different content types. Some are lessons learned, some are policies, some are information about people, and so on and so forth. Different content types, if you will. And we had people come in and try to find them. And we measured how long it took them, how many clicks and searches they used. We measured if they couldn't find it or if they found the wrong thing. I wouldn't get the percentage exactly right, but I believe it was very close to, it was over 50%. Things were not found or the wrong thing was found. So that's pretty bad. And it also gives us insights in which types of content, for example, lessons learned and expertise were the two hardest ones to find. Policies and corporate information were among the easiest to find. Okay, so now when I go talk about information architecture on the new intranet, or when I can talk about prioritization for new tools or development, I have some data that I can present that says, these are probably our top priorities. I can't, force that on anybody, but I have a tool now in my hands to help convince people of the value or the different challenges we're facing and prioritize accordingly. The idea is that 1 year from now we will measure again, and so on and so forth. But this will help us. It's a way to, not only that, it's a way to engage people around what you're trying to do, make them aware of what you're trying to do, and give them a sense of progress as you move forward. One side note, we are aware that with a migration, it might get worse before it gets better. Because people in the old system, however bad it was, some of them at least knew where things were because they were just been there for the last 12 years. So that's something we'll have to take into account as we go forward. In El Salvador, when I set up the KM program there, completely different approach, but measurement nonetheless. We used a team building workshops, not unlike spaghetti building type stuff that some of you have done in this session last time, about an hour ago. But what we got out of that team workshop was the practices, the things that mattered most to making those teams work in that country. So I'm talking about things like knowledge sharing, communication, project management, and so forth. What are the skills or capacities that the team needs to be effective? I wrote a maturity model around those practices, and then every team self-assessed against that. And that gave us a baseline. And then the team came back, and there were 7 practices, and they chose which are the ones that you want to improve and focus on in the next 12 months. Each team chose their own, and I said, okay, well, what's your target? Right now, your maturity model says this is where you are. It's not about the 1.9 or the 2.5. It's about the description of the types of capabilities you currently have and where you want to be. They all set their targets, and then we developed action plans to attack the main challenges that they identified for each of those. The results of that have been, and then a year later we measured, after we executed the action plan, that those areas that we focused on produced 40% better performance than those areas that were left out because they were not prioritized. So now we had a very powerful story to tell, take it back to headquarters at the IDB and saying, this works in El Salvador, this works in that pool, maybe we can visit other pools or maybe even go ocean-wide with this. And that's exactly what happened. A couple more. Anybody want to have a guess about this one? Every organization has them. Horse to water, yeah. There's always going to be people that are not going to get it. They don't want to work with you for whatever reason you may or may not understand. Some of them may matter, and some of them you may have to, keep going back to the well and trying to get them to drink even the smallest sip of water. But my experience is that more often than not, they're not worth it. They're not worth the extra energy it would take to get them on board. And more often than not, they'll come on board on their own later. This is also literally what happened to me, for example, in El Salvador, where there were a few people in specific roles, and they made a point of it to look extra grumpy whenever I would walk into the room because, I was just I don't know what they thought, but I certainly wasn't going to make a difference in their lives, and I was going to make it harder rather than easier. And I think it took about 7 months, and at that point, for those people were my biggest clients. They had the biggest demand because they saw things were happening elsewhere, right? And so they were sitting in their pool by themselves in their rubber duckies, but they did see what was going on in the other pool, and they kind of thought, okay. And so my experience was, don't worry about it too much unless you have to, but usually you don't. And just keep showing value through your work where you can. All right. And I think I have one more. So finally, before a closing thought, the main thing that this takes from the moment you walk into the door and you don't know what kind of room you're walking into to the moment you walk out that door is to be flexible. Because things, not only are you changing everything in an organization, everything around you keeps changing as well. New leadership can come in, new priorities can emerge, other priorities, things can be deprioritized, organizations can be reshuffled, so on and so forth. There's local cultures and teams. Obviously at the IDB I had to work with 26 or so countries, Caribbean, Latin, different cultures there, but even I would say within departments and divisions, there's cultures, there's ways of working. People tend to take on the personalities of their managers sometimes, and you have to be flexible in dealing with all of those, including those horses that don't want to go anywhere. Just a bit of context, at MCC, I've been there a little bit less than a year, I mentioned. We've had 7 CEOs, acting CEOs, or head of agencies since then. The KM program has been restructured, repositioned in the organization. We currently do not have a CIO, and we currently do not have a human resources manager. So if you're thinking about the stakeholders that matter for a KM program, being able to, if you haven't done all those things I talked about in the beginning in terms of setting up an organization, getting the things prioritized by the organization, rather than you coming in saying, let's do peer assists, and people go, what's a peer assist? Then you've already lost. But if you can get them to a point where I don't know exactly what operational learning is exactly, and they'll tell you, like, what are you going to do exactly? But I know that I want it. I got you that far, but tell me now a little bit more. And then you tell them a little bit more, and so on and so forth. And you keep building little pieces at a time. If you try to bite off more than you can chew, or more than the organization can chew, rather, at any one time, it'll come back on you rather quickly. But in the meantime, stay flexible and add value where you can. So finally, if you've done that, you should have a pretty solid foundation. And you should be able to build, and the sky can be the limit. Hopefully you don't end up in a Tower of Pisa situation, even though that tower is still standing after a good while, so it's not all bad. But it certainly helps to have a good foundation. I hope that with some of the stories I told, I gave you some new ideas about what it takes to build such a foundation. And I'm happy to take any questions you have. If you want to, I'll already put that up. If you want to get in touch with me, the best way is through LinkedIn. My name is rather unique. If you Google that, that's me. There is nobody else with that name. Any questions, thoughts, stories of your own? Please, I'll try to go around. Yeah, sure.
So my understanding of MCC is that each country you work with is its own team.
Correct.
So if you're trying to implement KM strategies throughout MCC, how do you do that when the teams are so individualized? How do you do that across the board and how to be successful?
Yeah. So a couple of sort of a bit of nuance. What we call MCA teams, so the executing agencies on the countryside, the country partners, stakeholders, however you want to call them, they're unique. But they also need to share knowledge among each other because it might be their first water project, but Morocco just did one 2 years ago, right? So there's knowledge sharing opportunity there. On the MCC side, they're relatively unique, but there are some shared resources between teams. So a water specialist from MCC might be on 3 different water programs at any one time. So there is that. We are organized in practices, technical practices, water, energy, infrastructure, and so forth. So all the specialists in those areas sit together. So I think that offers opportunities for knowledge sharing. The certain challenge that they face is time because our programs are always far away. We're in far-flung places from Solomon Islands, Nepal, Mongolia, Malawi, and so forth. The travel is pretty intense for people. So getting them to focus on something like lessons learned and knowledge sharing is quite difficult. The way that one of the things I've done, actually also based on something I first did in El Salvador, is I wanted to understand, the misconception when the picture about do people know what knowledge management is. The misconception that I find is the most common about lessons learned is that people assume that it's about when you get to the end of the project, you document your lessons learned so that they are available and can be reused. And everybody knows that in practice that actually is a very complicated structure and very likely to fail. So I'm trying to show those teams that what I'm interested in is what's happening in your programs now. So I'm using their quarterly reporting where they report on risks in the program. We're mapping those, and we can find relations. I can show you how I did this in El Salvador. I have a bunch of other stuff, but kind of looks like this. It's not exactly the same, but these are programs in El Salvador and the issues that they talked about and how they're related to one another, which I was able to turn into a map. We actually found that in El Salvador, that out of the infinite number of risks that programs can identify in execution, 17 of them covered 90% of everything they were talking about. Once we did that, we started mapping who had experienced issues with each of those 17 issues, who had solved them, and who had been successful at them. When we mapped those things out, we were able to find correspondence between programs in terms of where knowledge sharing opportunities existed. So that's the orange and dark orange. And what we did is, for example, these red ones turned out to be issues that almost all programs were dealing with. So to solve we did large-scale knowledge sharing for that. We organized conferences and things of that nature, invited international experts and so forth. On the orange ones, the other ones, those are smaller scales, 2, 3, 4 programs that they're all, in this case, El Salvador government programs, but they don't know from each other that they were having the same issue. So my favorite tool was to find a program that was having an issue that was in its first or second year of execution and pair it with teams that were in their third, fourth, and fifth to get them to talk to each other. MCC is going to be a similar model, and we've done some of those things between countries like Morocco and Georgia on operations and maintenance of schools. Georgia's finishing, Morocco is just facing this right now, so we've done knowledge exchanges matching those teams together just to talk about that issue to solve their problem now. While we facilitate and organize that process, we can document any relevant lessons learned and make them available later if we want to, but the focus is on improving the performance now, not at some eventual point of the future. Somebody else raised their hand there, yeah.
I was interested in what you were talking about with kind of the core KM team at the worker level and kind of how you go about building that team, particularly in an institution where there may be a lot of different departments that are doing a lot of different things. They may not think they all kind of have a common, I guess how to kind of get them to see that there is a commonality and they can all kind of come together to do what they can.
Yeah, so the KM core team is interesting. The hypothesis upon which it was established before I came was that they would be the implementing unit. And so they were all asked to dedicate a fixed number of, about up to 20-25% of their time to the KM program. That in practice turns out to be very complicated. Those people have full-time jobs. And 25% of their time is not easy to find for them. So, however, and I found that a lot of them, I have about 15 or so members, and I can sort of group them and categorize them in sort of why are they there. And some of them are there because they feel like they suffer from the challenges that exist, and they're determined there must be a solution, and I want to contribute to it. There are some people who are just generically interested in knowledge management. Others who are, let's say, other knowledge stakeholders, so they might be somebody from communications or somebody from publications who develops knowledge products, studies, and so on and so forth. Others are from technology and want to be sort of looped in and linked in. So it's really for lack of a better word, it's a smorgasbord of interests and individuals. So what I've had to do is really work with them more individually and find. So once first of all, they were very important and helpful in sort of getting me situated and helping me understand what the priorities and issues were, if what I was reading or hearing made sense or give me another perspective on it. But once we got the work plan sort of established, they were basically allowed them to be free. Like, what are you interested in? Because some, in the technology side, they don't care about the operational learning side. They just don't care. Others on the operations side might actually care about the taxonomy because they think it helps them find their documents. So every person is different, and every person gets treated differently. So I've worked with each person individually to sort of get a work plan for them, and then basically say, within the time that you can contribute, which turned out not to be 25% for most of them, what's realistic, right? Can we work at your pace? Can you contribute at your pace to something that we're working on? Can you own something? Can you own a work product and deliver it in time? And I would say, again, thinking of that picture where you don't have authority, I don't actually have authority over those people either, right? They sit in their home organization, so they voluntarily show up every week and they voluntarily contribute to what we're doing. The fact that the way we're working, I think, is allowed me to get the most out of it and maintain the ability to communicate very quickly with each of the departments and divisions, because that they can bring every week. What we start every meeting with news and notes from them. It's not me talking. So I just say, what's going on in your divisions and departments, right? And at the end of the meeting, they've heard something about KM, they can bring that back to their division, but we have to start with what they bring to the table. So I would say as a overarching implementing unit, I think it's weak. not its intent, and we've shifted the strategy to actually get dedicated KM specialists and resources assigned to the program rather than the core team. But the core team still exists in a slightly different with a slightly different focus in what it's working on. Are we on time?
There's 5 minutes left.
5 minutes left. Look at that. Anybody here's ever started a knowledge management program in an organization? Okay. Any stories that you want to share with the group?
Similar ones.
Well, that's
We're going through the issue right now where our president and a couple of our vice presidents have turned over through retirements. And I'm having
high risk.
What's that?
That's a high risk situation for a KM program.
And it's having to go back to, are they, are the new ones engaged? Do they understand what's doing it? Are they going to be behind it? It's going back to the first step and slowing it down.
It's nerve-wracking. Can be. Yeah, absolutely. Other questions or comments, observations, stories? You raise your hand as well?
Hey, I'm just curious, do you ever have your people you're trying to help ask you what knowledge is?
Oh, yeah.
And then how do you explain it to them in such a way that they understand it?
Well, I can't always speak for people's understanding, obviously, but I can show you, where am I? This is a slide I used to explain what knowledge is. Actually, I can go back one. I talk about knowledge as all the data, all the information, and all the insight and experience that can be brought to bear on our mission. And that's reduce poverty through economic growth. That's MCC's mission. Now, it doesn't have to be MCC's data, information, insight, and experience. Any data, any information, any insight and experience that exists anywhere that is relevant to us being successful. That's knowledge in knowledge management. KM's role within that framework is to enable MCC to come up with better solutions and make better decisions as they do that. And this is the main challenges that we have at MCC as it relates to these two things. So I've summarized this as findability already, and I've mentioned before that even though I think we have a pretty good culture at MCC that's open and receptive to operational learning, new processes, new ideas, there's gaps in those processes that already exist, and the practices that enable that effective capturing and sharing of knowledge, they're not optimized just yet. So it's a rather technical intervention that is required. Whereas coming from the IDB, I was expecting a very heavy load on the cultural side. And it turned out, like I said, those puzzle pieces, finding out where you can fit in. I was completely ready to do a lot of heavy cultural work, and I was not so ready to do a lot of heavy information management work, but that's what it is. Right? Yes?
So in your organization you have sectoral departments, right?
Yes.
Do they have embedded units on learning on key action support?
So they have, I sort of have a mantra where I say that organizations that do knowledge management best don't know that they're doing knowledge management. They might not even call it that. In fact, what I always hold up as the example, I won't say their name, but they don't have a knowledge management team or department, but they perform all the functions that a knowledge management group would be looking at. Are you doing this, and how well are you doing it? In MCC's case, they have done something like that, I'm not sure exactly, 5-6 years ago, I believe, where they restructured their sectoral work in practices. And they did that in recognition of a KM concept of community of practice. And they thought, rather than having all these specialists be individuals tied to just programs, we should sit them together, we should organize themselves, and we're going to have a practice lead oversee their work. Community of practice, leader. And so structurally, it's there at MCC. My finding in working with them is that while structurally there, they haven't yet adopted a lot of good practices around knowledge management and knowledge sharing that will allow them to, continuously learn from each other. I think it's sort of hit or miss, and some have done some good work over here, and some are just too busy and just haven't gotten around to it, and some did it when the last practice lead was there. They did something, but now that's not a priority anymore. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. And while I might have expected that, wow, you have practices, can use a practice ready to go, let me work with them, they have. I'm sure I will have to, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to do that. But they haven't been the most fertile ground yet for me. It's been more the individual country teams and their processes and their challenges as they're executing that have been the most fertile ground for operational learning, rather than the practice, even though they exist. So it goes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank
And round of applause.